Welcome to The Adoption Curve, the show where we explore how leading organizations are transforming their approach to turn technology adoption into a strategic advantage. In each episode, we'll sit down with a learning and enablement practitioner to get their inside story on how they're helping their organizations adopt and maximize their technology investments. Let's dive into today's episode. Ashton, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Sean.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Been looking forward to this conversation and appreciate you carving out some time to be here with us. By way of an example and kind of background, can you kind of frame up your current role now and just a little bit of how you got into enablement?
Yeah. Right now, I'm currently director of enablement for our SMB organization in the Americas at Salesforce. Previous to that was leading enablement for Slack. And how I got into enablement was actually as a rep. I was a sales rep. I was really excited about learning in a sales environment. I remember going to get a formal sales education because I was doing onboardings and learning, and I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And sitting through the training I went through at the time and just realizing that there's a process and a method to sales that you can practice, both the science and the art, I think for me really carved the path of, oh my gosh, I can teach people how to do this. I love doing this. When I was a rep, I spent a lot of time enabling back to the team because I sold partnerships. And I think really a spark for training happened there. And as I grew through organizations doing training, I got to see scale and complexity and just working across the entire business. And for me, that made it home.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the best enablers I know definitely have a background as a seller. I think being able to pull back on some of those experiences, have that level ground, it's very helpful. I do a fair amount of documentation and training and enablement now for our teams. And coming from the sales background, it's really helpful to be able to maybe pull on an example or reference things that you've done in the past and have like a tactical example versus maybe something out of a textbook. Moreover, that doesn't always resonate super well. Glad to hear it came from real life experience. From a philosophy standpoint, do you have kind of a methodology or like the way in which you think about enablement that's sort of matured as you've gone through these organizations? I know it's been sort of a journey as you went up market into a larger company now, but do you have kind of a methodology or a way that you think about that broadly?
Sure. I think when I was because I've been at startups and I'm now at larger companies, I think some of the same things are always true. You need to have your sales leaders involved and you need to be thinking about in-quarter success as much as you think about the next quarter and the next year. And it can be really challenging to balance it. I would say earlier in my career, I was very reactive and in quarter. I'm with my sales leader. What are we doing right now to push the business along? And not really thinking, well, in 2 to 3 quarters, who do we need to be and where are we at? I'd say now that I've moved not just up market, but I think to bigger scale, I'm really looking at what is our business strategy and our go-to-market strategy, and are our people where they need to be for us to do that? And that's partnership with HR, and are we hiring, are people attriting, but also is their skill set sitting where it needs to be for us to achieve this strategy? AI has changed so much of how we move forward. And I have a lot of conversations on, okay, we were launching AI. What's going to be hard for our folks to learn? Are they at the right seniority? Do we need to up level them in certain ways to be able to sell this new product with new pricing and new approaches? And I'd say I spend more time thinking about the strategy of who we need to be as opposed to the in-quarter success.
Well said. Yeah, I'm curious if you have any advice for those enablement professionals and maybe learning professionals as well. We're kind of stuck in that, I think we call it like the operational muck. They're sort of hired to achieve some outcomes. They're in the weeds. They're working with their frontline management teams. Obviously, this is very vital and important work to do, but there isn't always a great enablement playbook for the enablement function on how to help them zoom back out and get executive buy-in, holistically look at an organization, be able to have sort of like a strategic mind. It sounds like you kind of developed that on your own, but do you have any tactics for folks who maybe are stuck there now and they're trying to figure out how to zoom out, but they're still kind of being pulled into maybe the frontline work?
Yeah, I'd say the best advice I can give there is if you need to do it for 1,000 more people, what would you do differently? Scale really forces you to think about strategy. You just don't have the option, honestly, to really be laser focused on one outcome because there's so much happening. The other is, coming from a sales background, you got to hit your quarter. You can't miss the in-quarter success. It should never be a low priority item, but we don't burn down the door and forget about the house. So it's like, okay, what are the trade-offs of this quarter versus future? And really spending time sharing the risks and trade-offs. I think when folks are really tactical, they're really being guided by their sales leaders just on what they need and what's happening right now. And they're really tight to the business, but they aren't stepping back and going, where's my expertise and where can I offer value to prepare us for the next quarter? And the opposite becomes true when someone is too far out thinking about the next quarter who need to be. They're forgetting about the essentials, which is right now, if we're bleeding, we need to figure that out. So I would say think at scale, even if you're smaller, like what would you do differently? What would be the impacts? What would be the things that you might need to get that done? And be vocal about the risks and trade-offs so people can get on the bus with you. Enablers tend to build in this little private silo and not bring everyone along to like why we chose to do it this way instead of that, or what's the risk if we don't do this right now, or what are we okay with not doing because we're focused on the quarter right now, which is true. Sometimes you have to do that. But being able to respond to the movement of the business in real time is what's most critical. And depending on your business, that's going to look different. So you need to be aware of that.
That's great advice. Yeah, trying to make that balance between the execution level, but also being a strategic driver. Be curious around the priority setting as well. We find very often, especially when there's large initiatives, the organization will just sort of pass down very broad topics of like enable the team, drive up X initiative in this thing. And then it
Mhm.
falls on that, function to figure out like what actually is a priority. And that means choosing what you're not going to do as well. What else comes to mind there in terms of advice or just like maybe mental models where folks don't have as defined enablement priorities as they might like from leadership?
I laugh at this one because I work at a company that sells a lot of products. If anyone knows Salesforce, we have a lot going on at all times. We have very matrix decision making. There isn't one person who says yes or no. And there also isn't one set of priorities. We have priorities from the business, we have priorities at a global level, but then there's the local and the segment level where priorities might change or be different. When I'm trying to prioritize in any enablement initiative, I really try to think about three things. What did the business bet on in our go to market strategy? There's probably a new product launch or some market that you are going after. So, what's the big bet there? And how are you impacting that? That's usually where I get one priority. That's like the product we need to sell, the SKU, or the market we need to go after. And that's a whole element of one side of the scale. The second is what are your growth targets for your people? Are you hiring? Are you firing? Are you rolling out? Is something changing? You need to have your always on baseline priority. So that's going to be your onboarding. That's going to be skilling up anyone you need to have. Cannot afford to hire reps and then not make quota because it doesn't matter what you're training on after that if people are not ramped. And the third is what do you need to do in order to secure a foundation over multiple years? So when I think about that, that's like your tech stack. That is sometimes the unsexy stuff, right? Like your content organization. But the more foundation you put in place, it allows you to be more agile in the future. So, what are the things that are bogging down your team and preventing you from doing the big dream enablement that you need to spend time building a 3-year plan on? And that's usually going to be a tech change, a skill change, or a team you need to form or a council so that you can make decisions faster and move.
Yeah, yeah, well said. Change at the heart of each one of those those three, of course.
Of
Change
course.
management ends up coming up in almost every one of these conversations we do as a necessary evil that we have to figure out how to get good at and sharpen as a skill, because that's what we're doing, right? We're trying to enable folks to understand change and navigate change and understand it in those ways. Be curious kind of how you think about the change management piece, getting folks sort of bought in. Okay, we've decided this is a priority. We've decided we're focusing on this now. We've decided on what the program is going to look like. Now we got to get like this other party to actually do or join or attend or whatever that looks like. Be curious how you're thinking about the ability to sort of sell them on the concept of this new program that we've chosen.
So I will say the way you sell an enablement is exactly how you sell in sales, and the amount of people that do not use the same things you would use for a sales process, it's a miss. I got to figure out who my champion is. I got to figure out who signs the check. You got to know who those two people are and you need them on your bus as soon as possible. Really thinking about, are you moving through the organization to bring the right players in at the time of decision, at the time that you're making a big milestone, and early on? Everyone needs to understand why we're doing it, why it's important. So you almost need to soft launch a project, really sell it, get everyone excited and on the bus, and then start to move forward. The second is when you're making any change or launching any initiative, culture of how your company makes decisions and buys into things, you got to know. You got to be really tight on the DNA of that company, just like a seller. You got to know how they make decisions. Is it consensus? Is it procurement? Who am I going after? The same is in enablement. So I spend a lot of time identifying with my team who are the major players that we need on the bus. When do we need them on the bus? How do we get them on the bus? And then what are the jobs to be done throughout it? Enablers tend to do everything by themselves. Just because you're a team of one does not mean the work is done by one person. So building the work back plan, being the person to assign tasks, being the person to go, you're going to be the best person for this, this, and this, and following up really allows you to scale yourself, but also everyone is participating in making this thing successful. So you need to move as a group. And not to forget, how is your org doing right now? The overall health of it in terms of people operations. If people are miserable at work and we have like a human resources problem, training is not going to be the answer, right? If we're making some other big change, we just changed how everyone gets paid on their quota. Well, they're not going to be real excited about this new product you're selling until you're clear on those things. So being mindful of what else is happening to your people that's going to affect how this change hits them, and really being thoughtful about communications, keeping them in the know, helping them along, and having a fail safe for like, what are the health markers that it's not going well? And what do we do at those points? I think a lot of people think about the launch and they think about after. And it goes, where are the health checks to go? We're not on track. We're on track. We need to double down here so that you have the time to really make something successful, because a launch can be great and a project can still fail.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to get to the measurement part a little bit later in this conversation to think about that here. But yeah, the cross-functional sort of orchestration that needs to happen, I think that's worth underscoring for sure.
Mhm.
This is one that is true in any enterprise sale that you do, and quite frankly, any sale. There's always multiple departments and stakeholders involved. And one of the challenges is really that they're all measured, hired, promoted, and fired over different things, right? And so you in that
Mhm.
central seat, whether you're selling something to them or you in an enablement or learning role are a project manager effectively sort of owning this project, understanding at a deep level what is their motivations, that can be tricky. I mean, that is a skill set in and of itself to really understand how those businesses work. So it sounds like you're saying early and often get involved, try to really understand who you're working with, how your org is structured in those ways. Are you trying to align yourself to asking questions and being like, before that initiative happens, you're joining calls with some of those departments? Are you trying to ask questions in those, maybe those broader department crossover meetings as well? Yeah, do you have any tactics around that just to understand?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to know like how a company actually operates, even when you are in that company.
Totally. So I think there's like three ways that we can go about that. My favorite and first and foremost is if you have a sponsor, which most enablers have access to the CRO or a lead sales leader or like the person who champions most things. Pardon my French, we call it the get shit done person. You know who that person is in your company because they're the one you hear things from. Get their advice, get their feedback on your proposal and why it would work or not. They're going to be really good at the DNA of how decisions happen behind closed doors. The other is making sure you have, I call it like a comms plan is too light, but a strategy for how you are telling people what when. So we always have, before we start any initiative, the initial proposal stage. That is where you're shopping the idea around to the various executives and senior leaders at a like, what do you think about this? Light gut check, no slides, informal conversation. You're gathering that feedback and you're going to come back with a more formal proposal. That's going to be your slide deck, your meeting. Thank you so much for your input here. You've made it so much better. Here's where we landed. What does this still sound good to you? And then, you're usually going to get a yes. You're going to then secure your sponsor, who's the person who's sponsoring this project, and that person's driving accountability, keeping it top of mind with the executives. They're probably monitoring budget on it if it costs money. And that person is going to agree to meet with you more regularly than everyone else. And then you're going to have your cross functional shopping around. The people you need to get the work done. I often need my product marketers and my strategy folks on everything. So I have to go to them and go, what about this? We've already got approval. We'd love for you to be a part of it. Here's where I think you're most valuable. Do you agree? So you get everyone sign off on the jobs to be done. And by this point, we're almost at a full project team. And that's when you have project launch and you'd assign who's project leader on what, your different work streams, and you get moving. And then you decide on your field communication plans. How are you letting the field know this is coming? How often? What time? Is it leaders first, which I am usually a big fan of? And when do you let your individual contributors know? And how are you keeping them in the loop on this win? When you're running a project, especially a long-term one, let people know when you've had wins. We love to record little testimonials from a rep in a training saying it was great. Is it something I'm going to put up to the executives? No. But am I going to share that around the business to keep buzz and energy up for what we're running? Of course. And so we really have to think about the different people who can affect it and how are you keeping them engaged throughout the initiative. Another one I love is forming a council. So, if a project is big enough, build your project team or your A team of both the field, so have sales reps who are going to advise on that and be champions of that change, and your cross-functional partners who are going to help you get the work done, depending on the scale and size of the change, of course.
You mentioned the wins, pulling out something. Is that an example of maybe one of those small health checks throughout the process? Like if you have something like that you can use as a kind of a qualitative measurement of anecdotal feedback or something else that's a win, and then try to use that as circulation. Is that kind of what you're thinking about when you say like a health check?
Kind of. So actually, I should give the framework for health checking. That's a great, great question. Whenever I run a project, I usually align with the executives on how we look at success and who's responsible for what part of the success. The first is what we call like reach. That's going to include your launch. And did we actually reach the people we need to? So we set out and invited 200 reps and 50 showed up. Well, we're probably not going to get the ACV we bet on because no one showed up. And the CSAT was really bad and they didn't enjoy the training. We're probably not going to get the results. We didn't get that launch right. So that's one health check. The next is what enablement's responsible, which I call readiness. After you run any type of initiative, you have to check, did people learn it? You got to have an answer for that. How do I know they're enabled? That can be a quiz, that can be a test. Sometimes that's a pitch, whatever it is. There's some type of administration from an enablement arm of, I know I can say that I delivered readiness for you. Your people know how to do this, and they're ready for me to hand off to the manager for what is now our third check, behavior change. So are they actively doing this with customers? Are they applying it? How are we checking that? That's where your managers come in and you're holding them accountable. Like, we've given readiness. We know they know how to do it. It's your job to make sure they're doing it regularly. And we all as a group assume that results will follow if we get those three things right. So at every one of these stages, there is an album cover of how it's going and a highlight. Testimonial at launch, that is when leaders want to say, like, how are people feeling about this change? Did they like it? Were they happy? That's when you have, I call them the happiness surveys, but that's the time to have that conversation, and it's a real win. It's not at results though. And so at knowledge, are people all failing the test? Well, then maybe the launch actually wasn't that good. They had a great time, but it didn't work. And that's where we can see, like, who's accountable and where did we see places that we could do better or that we need to reinforce and start over.
And then at the comms level, if we're breaking down, especially a field staff of this sort of size, is every initiative having a different approach for how we're teasing that out to the end field staff? Like, are we thinking about the segments and those teams, or we're going to the functional leader or the team leader in that sense? Just be curious how you think about like the comm structure. Does that switch per project, or do you have any like best practices?
It changes depending on, I will say, like the importance of that project to the business and how many cross-functional partners you have. So I was rolling out a kickoff that has a lot of people. I think the team on that was like 60 people to run a kickoff, but my tiny team of 3 is who orchestrated 60 people. So the comms plan there was like very intense because we had to manage the people going through the kickoff and all their comms through the event, leading up to it, preparing all the leaders and all of the operations to get it done. That had a pretty heavy comms plan. When we think about comms, we very much think about meeting people where they are. So yes, we have Slack. We obviously Slack people. We create channels. We do all of those things. We also tend to email people because they're going to answer their customer email. So if they missed a Slack message, they saw the email. There's things like having slides for leaders to put in their. So we create packets for leaders, say, this is for your weekly call. This is the slide update. Like, here's the talk track. Get it to your teams. So really meeting people where they are when it comes to comms is important. And it seems like a lot of upfront work, but whatever you leave behind speaks for you when you're not in a room. So we are big proponents of, like, every project has a walking deck that you could drop off and someone can understand where we're at, how's it going, and take a few slides that they can go present on your behalf, because people will do that when they're excited about something.
Yeah, that's a really good one there, especially when you've got so many initiatives going on and they're just being bombarded by information constantly. They need the TLDR in clear language about where we are, but what the initiative was in the first place. So that you had that more of like a deck format so that they can still self-serve that, apart from maybe that first session where the leader kind of goes through as a general update.
Yeah, we have 2 types of decks that I'd say on my team we use the most. So one is, we call it the source of truth deck, and that is all the things about the project. That's who the working team is, what are the work streams, all their milestones. It's going to be a more technical project management deck, but it's going to include, why are we setting out to do this? What are we hoping to impact? How is that being measured? Who is measuring it? What are the work streams to get there? What is the timeline? It also has a list of all the communication plans and anything else that might go in there. And then we have what's called like our road shows. And those are decks specifically made for the end audience. Think our sales leaders, the field, where we're presenting the project. It might have an executive summary. It's going to have a few slides that are, more visually exciting and less tactical, but it really is also going to be, why are we here? What are we doing? What are we hoping to achieve? What's your part in it? Some details on it and next steps. And we will do a roadshow update. We'll decide that frequency depending on the project. But the single source of truth is where like the working team pulls all their slides from and we build there. And then we put it in both an executive deck and a roadshow deck that goes out to our fields.
Yeah, I love this. I know we're in the weeds here, but it's I think this is really great. Good context for folks to understand, just programming wise, how some of these things are set up. So I appreciate you sharing all that. You were talking about a kickoff that you did. I believe it was last year. You're mentioning you had a very large one that you were a part of it was an AI product internally that your team was launching. Can you give us a little more
Yes, I was
detail on
still with
that?
Slack. For sure. I was still with Slack, and Slack throws an annual kickoff. We call it GSO every year. And this was a year where we were launching our first AI product. And we decided, when we looked at the question of are our people where they need to be in order to execute on this strategy, we knew they weren't. No, everyone was new to AI. We were all trying to learn it. And there was no way that, a video training was going to get us to where we needed to go. So we actually threw a kickoff that was in 3 different places in the world: Sydney, Australia, Dublin, Ireland, and Seattle in the US. They all streamed into each other. And we had I think 2 or 3 days of training, keynotes, getting aligned on our product roadmap. What I loved most about this was our sales leaders really drove a ton of the content. So we did a all hands call the week before this to really cover the keynote stuff where you're just sitting and listening and absorbing. And we had all of our C-suite go through the strategy, the roadmap, the stuff that you can watch on your own, and you will because it's really important to the business. And we spent our in-person time on real deals. We had big deal motion clinics. We had a pricing best practices. We dove into how do you actually sell this product and what are the objections you're going to get? What are the questions you have? We had product leaders come and actually walk through demos with everybody. Everybody had to do their own little demo of the products while we were there. But we really spent that time, not just in an auditorium, but getting inspired, of course, and hands-on with how are you going to go execute this tomorrow? Because you're going to walk out of this room and you need to go sell that product.
Yeah, trying to put together an AI suite and doing it in person is that's an interesting approach. That must have been a fascinating experience to be a part of. I'd be really curious around the concept of the technical know-how. I think this happens a lot with AI, where selling the dream is one component of this, of course, right? And the magic that it's there, and the magnetism that a potential customer comes in thinking about an AI product and what's possible. And then there is the rep or the field staff understanding how to position, price, all those sort of things. Then they also need to have like the technical skills to like figure out how to stand some of these things up. Of course, they have support mechanisms and sales engineers and the like. We'd be curious about that balance, because we find this similar to what you described with like keynote high level why concepts, and then the what, like here's what we're going to cover. But then the how piece, this is always one we get pulled into a lot, where they're saying I need to drive and make sure my staff understands what they need to do, but they also need to know how to do it. I don't also want to stand up there and talk at them about where to click and what to enable in the settings and those sort of things. Rolling out a big initiative like that, like how are you balancing some of that how training with that what training, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I'd say we first got aligned. So that was our all hands call. Our CEO came and talked about why this is the most exciting product we're going to launch. And honestly, we're at the forefront of AI. It was super exciting time to be part of Slack. And we got to hear and really get on the same page with the vision. And that's the story you're going to tell your customers. And, at the kickoff, our CRO broke down the exciting parts, which are like the TAM, who can use this? What are the cool things we can do this for? So that everyone is really on the same page about why this is a great use of time, but also the energy to go self-study comes from those 2 pieces getting right. Because I'm not going to take you through a click tutorial live in person. You don't want that either. You want to pause it, you want to try it, you want to come back. Those are all real things that are actually important for self-study. But if I don't know why I need to know that, then I don't care. So I would say we did a really good job of getting everyone hyped, excited, but also understanding like it means cash in your pocket generally for sales reps. That's the number one thing you need to talk about. And being able to have new and fresh conversations with your customers who are also at the forefront of AI and excited. And if you want to talk to a C-suite who is nerding out on AI on his own, you have to understand it. You can't go in there learning. Like, you can learn from your customer about their business, of course, but you have to present yourself as an expert. And that requires a touch more technical expertise. And we were honest with our team. You haven't had to do this in the past. You could just call your SC and it was fine. But this is more of a thought leadership conversation in how the world and the economy are changing with the innovations of AI. And you have to be able to keep up in that executive conversation. In order to do that, we had to break down some key principles. But we also took multimodality. So there was a certification that everyone did. At a company level, we all had to learn AI, even myself, and do a bunch of courses on it throughout the course of a year. We had pitch competitions, so everyone felt confident and got the at-bats that they need so they could really have the pitch conversation. But we also had thought leadership and panels with different parts of the business to hear how they talk about it. A really big one was inviting our product leaders to talk about how they are thinking about the future of the roadmap, how AI is going to change, and what it can and can't do. Because there's a lot to be desired when something is brand new and everyone has really high expectations, but the reality of how it's working is different. And I think we did a good job of balancing that. Even now, AI has moved so much in the last year. And the level of technical required is now higher than it was last year. You could have been a thought leader last year. This year, you got to talk to me about your data sources. Where is it coming from? Which one is it? How is it powered? And you have to understand why someone would care about that. And there's a ton of security concerns. So we actually ran a series following the kickoff focused specifically on security, the technical aspects, because that required more care. And people need that. They can come back to that. So a virtual setting worked there because they want to record it. They want to keep it. They want to come back to it when they need it.
Yeah, I love that structuring. And of course, the sort of post-call feedback, I'm sure, was a lot around jobs to be done. As I'm selling this, you referenced that most of the FAQs were around security and how do I navigate this conversation. And so you build like the subsequent content that's more of a pull, right? Because now they're in the flow of doing that work and they need that content, they need that learning, and now the appetite's there. But if you were to dump that on top of them in the beginning and say, learn all of this stuff on their own before they were even excited about that or had the why, the buy-in, any of the capacity, like that wouldn't have worked. So I think that's a beautiful way to kind of frame that out, especially when it's a product launch that we're selling. It means motivation's there. It's money in our pocket as a salesperson. This is something that I'm going to help my customers with, and we're going to be able to, there's an excitement behind that. Be thinking through the inverse for the internal product, right? Because for every product launch that we're doing with our own products that we're selling, it feels like there's about 20 internally that are going on. Every rep's getting, okay, here's the new Salesforce CRM AI you have to use, and this thing and that thing, and there's all this stuff that's being layered on top of them. The incentives are different, right? Because they may not see this as money in my pocket when I've got to go through this field or I have to learn this new AI flow. How do you think about that same level of buy-in and behavior change when it's like policy and process versus like a product I get to see?
Totally. Yeah, it's really funny. I had a conversation about this last week because coming from Slack, it's a very different culture when it's your own tool that you use every single day in your day-to-day life. The excitement and the expertise that's going to flow there when you use your own product is super high. When we get into, the rest of Salesforce, people still know our products through and through, but there are many more of them, and some of them they're not going to use in their day-to-day. And so when we think about how people adopt products in their personal productivity versus how we ask them to do things for, compliance and visibility, those are separate tracks. And I think my favorite is everyone must have a foundation of personal productivity. That is my personal belief. Any team I'm on, they'll tell you, I'm like, we're doing a Slack training. Does everyone know how to use Google Slides? Because it's the 13 clicks that you don't care about that actually waste the most of your time. So really making sure that as a rep, you build a culture on the excellence of personal productivity. You personally need to be faster, stronger, better. And that's not just in how you pitch a deck. That's actually in how you manage your time, your downtime, how you put into your CRM. So really making sure that everyone has a culture around being great there is good. What we saw at Slack was like an impatience for inefficiency. Like if you watch someone click too many times, you were like, my gosh, like, please let me show you. Like, everyone knows how to like be like, I can't believe that you don't have your section set up or something like that. So there's a lot of passion around that and energy around that. But when it comes to a more compliance tool, think, entering into the CRM, making sure your calls are recorded, the things that most reps like have emotional responses to, because people don't want to not do that stuff. It's either it's cumbersome and it's in their way. There's an emotional response, a feeling of risk. Recording calls is a great one. I don't want to be seen or heard because I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. That often comes from confidence and training. And then the third is like, are you actually checking? Is this valuable for real? The amount of products we roll out where we say, do this, use this, we have no mechanism of checking, did you do it? Or reporting back to the reps any value on taking the time to adopt this process. It's unfair. They've got 100 things to do. They need to be focused on their customer. If you can't show them why it's good for them to do or good for the business, and you're not reporting out and making a splash about it, you're going to lose people. The other thing is checking that it's not a skill versus will problem. Sometimes people are just afraid. I myself am learning AI. There's a ton of processes that I don't know. And as a senior leader, I'm like, I don't know if I have time for this, right? But I have to learn it. And there is an emotional response to that type of change in your day. And with reps, there's, inspection, supervision. I'm not sure I made the right call with that customer. So they don't often want to offer transparency until the deal is closed, until it's a sure thing, because your forecast you get held accountable to. So we actually teach them to be really afraid of promising something and not delivering. And the same behavior kind of trickles into adopting technology. So I always say, like, start with like, are people on board? What would get in the way of doing this? And talk to them. What would it mean in your day if you didn't have to call these 5 people to get this done? What would that do for you? If it doesn't bother you, great, keep doing it. Hope your ACV is high. If it's not, well, sorry, come back here, right? But I think we often don't want to have that real conversation of why aren't we doing this, guys? And sales leaders actually do that with their team all the time. The amount of team calls where leaders like, I don't understand. Why can't you just put your forecast in? And someone will go, well, the last time I put my forecast in, you sent it to the CRO without talking to me, and I got a phone call at 11 p.m. Yeah, I wouldn't put my forecast in either because you yelling at me is not the same. And I think we don't spend time on, why people are hesitant to make change. And then, the change has to be worth it. There's sometimes we ask people to do things and we let operations decide without really checking. Can you live without this? Is the pain and stress we're putting on the reps worth it? Because sometimes it's not. It's an extra data field and nobody checks it. I was at one company where we asked everyone to report every competitor and we never looked at that data. So in filling out your CRM, you had hundreds of competitors. We cared about 3. We searched for those 3, but we didn't look at any of the other ones. So people are saying, hey, I've seen this competitor 3 or 4 times. Like, am I going to get a playbook on it or something? They're like, no. So, really making sure that the change drives value. And if it doesn't, clarifying where that value is coming from and why it's good for everyone to do.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I also think from the enablement standpoint, mirroring the same things that you've covered here in this conversation that I might do for a customer facing product launch internally for those same things as well. Obviously, you're doing the things like the documentation and the training and the decks and whatever those things are for those projects. But I do find that there ends up being a little more of just forward it over on the internal side versus something that's public facing, like a customer related initiative tends to get this, it's in for whatever reason, attributed closer to revenue than this internal process that feels like it's a couple steps removed from revenue. Arguably they're the same, but one could argue that this one's a little bit more removed. And I do find that those are the processes that tend to be what causes the most friction internally, right? I think when there's a customer revenue on the line, everybody gets behind it and works together and figures out how to collaborate. But once an internal thing, it becomes, well, Mary's making me do this thing over here and I don't understand. So taking the same concept of the why behind these things, getting leadership to help speak about why we're actually prioritizing AI in our internal workflows. And I'd be curious if you're doing anything with champions on that side, the 20% of reps that are like pulling in new technology, like interested in using it in their own workflows. To your point about personal productivity, like, can you highlight some of them? Have you seen folks do that where they're showing like, hey, Susan's really doing a great job in this flow. What does that look like if we try to scale that out and using the peer versus it always being like a push down from an enablement function?
I feel like we underestimate the value of peer anything in all careers. Peer advocacy, that person might be your boss one day. Be good friends on that team. And the same is true for sharing of best practices. will say younger in my enablement career, I really believe what we call it the push method. So everything has to come from me to the reps. And now I would say there's some things that in order to be a top seller, you got to go get. And if you don't know that you need to go get that, sure, I'll help you. But a good example of that is I think of industry knowledge. Like, yes, your business can provide you some industry expertise, but if you are selling into a specific industry, you got to have a podcast. You got to be on top of your, the things your customers are seeing. You got to be in the newspaper looking for that. That's not something that you should be like enablement. Please help me. I'm like, go pick up the New York Times. I don't know. But there are some things that are, we need to set expectations around what excellence looks like. And I do think, again, your personal productivity, staying on top of your industry, and how you kind of go about pulling things is really important. So sometimes we spend so much time on the initiatives we push down, and we don't spend enough time on how do we make it easier for people to grab what they need? How do we empower them? And insert peer learning. You know, I worked at one company where we were selling a new product, and, nobody trusts marketing when the product hasn't sold yet. Marketing, even though they spent hours, a million hours researching this, proving the TAM, they did all the work. That's why we're investing in it. But salespeople were like, nah, no one sold it yet. Don't believe you. Which I get. But instead of marketing spending all their time sharing, the research they'd done, we had a campaign where every single deal, every single conversation that came up and every deal that closed, you had to record a quick 2-minute clip on what'd you talk about? What was hard? What do you wish you knew going in, and how'd it go? And that became a library of this new product. We're all learning together, but we're sharing. How's it going? What are the conversations I'm happening? I'm sharing customer clips. I'm sharing, an objection I got. I'm sharing, actually, this is a really good idea and we don't have that. Or turns out another company does do this feature thing that we don't do today. But that sharing in a deal comes from high performing teams want to be the best, and they want to know that they're on a team of the best. And that means you got to talk about how you make your sauce. You got to talk about how you close the deal. And nobody doesn't want to stand on a pedestal and say, here's how I close this amazing deal. Listen to how great I am. So it's not actually a hard pull, but we don't spend enough time in enablement operationalizing that. It is hard to collect. It does take time. It can feel like a chore. And so you have to think about, depending on the size of your org, I have 5,000 people. If we want to make clips like that, that's hard. My team cannot be the ones to do that, but I can partner with leaders to have a weekly where it's like collect those and share them out. Spotlight someone every week. There's some things you can think about, but we spend so much time thinking about what we can push down, and they've got a lot going on instead of going, how do I just make it so you can find what you need in the moment? Because sometimes that's the most helpful thing we can do.
Yeah. Back to the culture piece, right? Setting up a culture that is, sort of surfacing that sort of that know-how and wanting to kind of prop each other up and have those kind of success stories. That's fantastic. Yeah. As we start to wrap up here, one of the last things I wanted to cover was the sort of transition and acquisition component with Slack and Salesforce. I think this is very interesting perspective that you have here, going from a huge logo, very well known out there in the space, into arguably one of the bigger of the SaaS players out there. From an enablement standpoint, like, tell us a little bit about that experience, about navigating two huge enablement learning functions. Any takeaways or learnings from that experience?
Yeah, I joined a year into the acquisition, so I had the benefit of being hired by Salesforce and supporting Slack. Slack will forever hold a near and dear place in my heart because I learned so much through that time with them. I'd say two things are always true because I've also worked at a startup and I've also worked at a 60,000 person company. When you get acquired, you were killing it. The things that you were doing were working. They got spotlight, you got funding, you got acquired. It's a huge winning streak. And I think of it a lot like when you graduate high school and you get a scholarship, and then you get to university and your first year isn't as great. Your grades are never as high as they were in your last year of high school for most people. The same is true for an acquisition. And it's not, even if you're getting acquired by a smaller company, it's you're graduating to a new playing field. And I think the most successful integrations happen when people buy into that. And the least successful integrations happen when people go, we don't need to change. We were doing it just fine. That's why you brought us here. Also, not all acquisitions are purchased for the same reason. So sometimes it's the product, sometimes it's the people, sometimes it's one little piece, sometimes it's to buy market, sometimes it's to buy its customer book. So getting acquired while like on the receiving end, you're like, this is amazing. Businesses buy businesses for all kinds of reasons. And I think coming in with an open mindset is really important. When we were thinking through enablement, and not to say we didn't have hiccups or bumps, it was definitely not perfect. It never is. But we did spend time on understanding that we are merging two cultures. I worked at a startup. Salesforce was the enemy of every startup. It was who you did not want to be until you got big enough where you were like, actually, no, I do want to be them. But it was the thing that fueled you was to be anti-corporate, right? So there's a culture of we do it ourselves, we bootstrap it, look at us winning, we're the little guy taking out the big guy. And you have to acknowledge that and the culture of how people are moving through their work before you think about teaching them things. Because again, you have to meet people where they are. So what we did get wrong is we initially were like, here's the Salesforce way. And that didn't matter. They were like, we actually actively didn't want to do that. We got to a place where we were like, oh, hold on. We understand why these two businesses are coming together. And there's a huge opportunity to learn from each other. There's a lot that we do here that's great. And there's a lot of scale that we don't have that we're going to learn from the bigger business. And I think it took a little time to get there, but those conversations were so important. When I'm thinking about the enablement function, we were a tiny team. We did everything ourselves. We built everything ourselves. We ran all our enablement on our platform. But, you increase that scale to 13,000 people and that breaks. So there was a lot of, it felt like growing up in a startup, but like a lot of things broke down and we had to use enterprise grade tools to do them, which, prioritize security sometimes over that ease of use, which is everyone knows that. But there was pain around some of that. And there were huge wins around some of that. So I'd say I feel spoiled because I work at a company where I get to use all of the tools we own every day. So there's a lot there that, it's not a vendor, it's us. That's very cool. I can go meet with the product team any day of the week. But when we think about the learnings from kind of that period, especially in enablement, was meeting people where they are, understanding the culture of how they like to win and really framing things that way and being mindful of like, what do they have to change and what can stay the same? What doesn't need to be ruffled? Because sometimes we look for compliance in an MBA and it's not necessary. Like I don't care how you get it done. You need to make the same ACV you did last year. If not saying this thing is going to get you there, cool. But there were some things where you did have to acknowledge, like you're part of a bigger suite of products. So it's not just about your product anymore. You got to think about the customer lines and how their tech stack is working. And we had to spend a lot of time focused on like the customer empathy, the change for your customer, the change to the product, and less on how do I push as much content for compliance as possible. And I think in any M&A on both sides, someone will tell you probably the same thing.
Ashton, that was extremely helpful from a breakdown standpoint. I think that brings up a lot of themes that we've covered, a lot that just good general advice for any enablement professional who's thinking about this, thinking about culture, thinking about those end audiences, aligning to stakeholders, figuring out what we absolutely need to change versus what we'd like to change, what's reality, placing a map on some of those things, I think is really important. I think that's a fantastic place to wrap up. I think you gave us a ton to take away here. We really appreciate you carving out some time to be here. Where can folks find more about you, give you a follow, check out more of your content?
For sure. Just look me up on LinkedIn. Ashton Williams. You'll see all my content posted there. I'm sure I'm floating around YouTube, but it's all on LinkedIn too.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we'll drop a link in there so folks can follow you and get more of your stories here. So thank you again for taking some time to be here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Adoption Curve. If you've enjoyed today's conversation and want more content like this, I highly recommend subscribing to our newsletter where we break down insights, frameworks, and templates from our guests on each show. To access, go to iorad.com/newsletter. Also, make sure you subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. If you could, we'd also love it if you could leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed and got value out of today's conversation. The Adoption Curve is produced by iORAD, the tool that helps thousands of companies make interactive tutorials in seconds. They're shareable in all the tools you use every day. We'll see you on the next episode.